Back in 2019, news would come out that Mike Babcock would force a 19-year-old Mitch Marner to rank his team based on effort. But little did Marner know that Babcock would show this list to the entire team. In what world does alienating your next franchise player against the rest of the team make sense? How in the hell does this help Mitch Marner develop into a great player? It doesn't, as Mike Babcock was known to prey on young players, as he knew that veterans wouldn't take his shit. He knew that veterans already made the money and weren't worried about a coach ending their career, as he would bully young players to the extent where he would constantly make them break down in tears. And once this news became public, it would cause a shitstorm across the hockey world, as previous players would bring up other stories. These stories would highlight that Mike Babcock is a sociopath. And one of these stories involved Johan Franzen. And if you are new to hockey, Franzen was one of the toughest SOBs the game has ever seen. In fact, he was a guy who put his body on the line. He was a warrior who endured so much physical abuse on a game-to-game basis, he would have to prematurely retire from hockey. But this is where the story gets absurd. Mike Babcock would see Franzen putting his body on the line for the sake of the team. Once he got back to the locker room, the man would bully him to the extent where Franzen was constantly having mental breakdowns. He would break out into tears in front of the team. And this story was also backed up by NHL legend Chris Chelios. Like seriously, he would go from abusing his body on a game-to-game basis, throwing everything on the line, only to be belittled in front of the team from his coach. So, what about the veterans? When Jason Spezza signed with Toronto, it was a great story, as around this time Patrick Marleau, who took on the role as a mentor, had just left the team due to cap issues, where Jason Spezza would want this role. So much so, he would sign a contract at the league minimum. In fact, that summer, he would show up to Toronto before any other player to get a head start on how he would mentor young players on the team. So, what does Babcock do? Even though he knew Spezza was bringing a bunch of his family to the home opener, a game that was versus the Ottawa Senators, aka Spezza's past team, Mike Babcock would healthy scratch Spezza. Why? To tell Spezza that he has control over the room. You do not. Just another example of how the man is a power-hungry control freak. But it gets worse. Much worse. Mike Modano is one of the greatest American hockey players of all time, where he would sign with Detroit for a final run. And I kid you not, Mike Babcock would purposely healthy scratch Modano for the final 6 games, knowing he was going to retire the next year, so that he would not hit the 1,500 game milestone, where Modano would finish his career with 1,499 games played. But here's the thing, when you are abused from a coach for years, and finally get that separation through trade or retirement, people tend to put those memories in the past. And I guarantee you that there are still countless stories of Babcock's abuse if past players wanted to come out. So when Columbus hired him this past offseason, it was shocking. But here's the thing, I'm a firm believer that people make mistakes. And the only way to grow as a person is by learning from other people's mistakes or by learning through your own mistakes. However, before coaching a single game, Mike Babcock was back on his BS. The stories would come out that Mike Babcock would first start with the GMs, ask for some family pics, pretty innocent. He would then go to the veterans, maybe go a little bit deeper. Let me see your phone, I'll scroll through some photos. But when it came to the young players, he would take their phone, go through their texts, photos, and then say nothing. Why, you ask? Babcock would use photos and texts from their summer. Keep in mind, their decompression time, the time for relaxation, where he would then use it as ammunition to throw against guys when they weren't playing well. And because he started with the management and veterans, they would assume that Mike Babcock was doing the same thing. He looked at my photos, he looked at yours, whatever. But when he got to the young players, he would take it another step. Why does he do this? So that if and when a player complains, the GM and veteran would have already had that happen to them. But little did they know that Mike Babcock took it way further with the young guys. This is the brain of a sociopath. In fact, one of the stories was that Mike Babcock invited a player to his home for lunch. Wow, great guy, right? When the player got to his house, he would take his phone, go through his texts, messages, and keep in mind, he said nothing. he would then hand back his phone and tell that player to leave. The man didn't even get lunch. Imagine if you went out on the weekend with your boys or girls, where you just had a stressful work week and wanted to blow off some steam. The next day at work, your boss says, "Why were you drinking on the weekend?" And not only focusing on the next work week. And then he fires you. What the hell does decompressing in your spare time have to do with how well you work the next week? Now, of course, past NHL players have had a tendency to party and drink a lot. However, we are not in that era anymore. Of course, there's always going to be players, who like to booze a bit too much. But by no means is that the entire NHL. If you're a coach, single out those players. That's fine. But you can do that without having to flex your power on the entire team. Because here's the thing, it's not even that this single example with Columbus would be enough to get fired. No, it was the fact that this man was shunned from the NHL for years, came back, and somehow did not learn from past mistakes. This is the mind of a sociopath. Now, imagine if a sociopath was also equipped with a psychology education. When you consider that he has studied how people tick, how people operate, we are now talking about a monster. Especially when you consider that he still doesn't get the message or even understand that manipulating his players outside the game of hockey is wrong. If a player's showing up drunk, not going to practice, drinking after games, sure, lecture them then. But how is it any coach's business how a player decompresses in their spare time? But on the positive side, this incident will without a doubt set a precedent for future coaches to know where to draw the line. 10, 20 years ago, we would never see a player go against his coach. Well, specifically young players. Because back in the day, head coach was another name for drill sergeant. Many coaches would take the approach of psychological warfare, an extreme approach where coaches attempt to break down their players to the extent where they are stripped of their identity and reshaped into a person or player that the coach wanted. Now, this may seem dramatic, but it's the truth. This coaching style revolves around negative reinforcement. If you make a mistake, you are benched. If you make another mistake, you are sent down. We've heard it time and time again from past and current NHL players. The idea of making a mistake, leading to your career and livelihood being taken away, can lead to players having debilitating anxiety. Imagine if you made a mistake at work. Maybe it's even a small one, that you would be fired. Not only is that a toxic environment, but those people are never gonna live up to their potential. If they think that a mistake means they don't have money to feed their children. In the world of hockey, many of those players will play it safe. They won't take chances, where they end up developing into a player that is a shell of their former self. The idea of coaches relying on negative reinforcement is a backwards ass approach. And there's a reason why this coaching style has almost entirely faded from the game. Sociopath coaches are obsessed with power, and this obsession goes completely outside the game of hockey. So as a coach, why not instead focus on motivating the players, elevating their strengths, working on their weaknesses? Let them make mistakes, knowing that the next time, that player might not make that mistake. Now obviously there is a limit, but as we know with these old school coaches, that limit wasn't much, it was just small mistakes.